It's 1996, WCW is on fire, the WWF is on life support, and nobody in charge seems to know what they're doing. Here's everything that went wrong that year in the World Wrestling Federation. And for the second year in a row, the Royal Rumble match was terrible. It was packed with nobodies like Doug Gilbert, Barry Horowitz and the SWAT team. These were just bodies to fill the ring, and obviously none of them had any shot of winning. The pacing of the match was all over the place and there were no surprise entries at all, although Vader looked very impressive making his debut. He looked like an absolute beast, throwing bombs in there, and even after he got eliminated, he stuck around to cause even more carnage. He was easily the most exciting thing about the entire match, but all told, he only got about 11 minutes in the ring. It was Shawn Michaels who entered at number 18, and he went on to win the match for the second year in a row. Also at the Royal Rumble, Goldust was proving to be a divisive character, both on screen and backstage. After his debut in 1995, the fans didn't really know what to make of him, although the WWF was leaning into his ambiguous sexuality as a way to piss them off by this point. He beat Razor Ramon here for the Intercontinental title, and their feud was supposed to go all the way to WrestleMania, but Razor didn't want to play with Goldie. Scott Hall was uncomfortable with the storyline that basically saw Goldust coming onto him as part of his mind games. Scott wasn't trying to be difficult, he just didn't want to confuse his kid, who was sat at home watching Dad on TV every week. Having Goldust trying to hump him on Raw wasn't something that he wanted his son to see, so they dropped the angle. But you can say what you like about Goldust, but at least he wasn't another forgettable gimmick in 1996, because this was the year we were introduced to TL Hopper, the evil plumber. Then there was the Goon, who was an ex-hockey player who still brought his stick to the ring with him, like he couldn't let go of the past. Then there was Salvatore Sincere, an overly polite Italian guy, the joke being that he wasn't sincere at all. And who can forget who? The joke being that nobody knew who he was. It's like Vince looked at the ratings at the time and thought, how can we make them even worse? How can we make the fans turn the channel over even quicker? And then there was the return of the Ultimate Warrior. After nearly 4 years away, Warrior was hyped up like a returning god, with vignettes trying to make it feel like it was 1990 all over again. At WrestleMania, he faced Triple H. Warrior was always going to win, but he was at least supposed to sell some of Hunter's moves. Instead, he squashed him in under 2 minutes, which included him popping straight back up after a pedigree. Warrior's next feud was with Goldust, and that was a total mess. Warrior hated the Goldust gimmick and didn't even want to touch him. Their big showdown at In Your House 7 ended in a countout, and then they dropped the feud. After that, Warrior was handed Jerry Lawler in one of the most half-hearted feuds of the year. Lawler mocked Warrior's comic book, leading to a nothing match at the King of the Ring, where Warrior beat him in under 4 minutes. It wasn't long after that he was fired after missing a bunch of house shows, and he wouldn't be seen in the company again for nearly 20 years. It turned out that going back to that particular legend was a total waste of time. One man who was in the process of becoming a legend was Shawn Michaels, and at WrestleMania he faced Bret Hart for the WWF title in an Iron Man match. In the lead up to the match, they did a redemption storyline which made it pretty obvious that he was going to win. Back in October 1995, Michaels got a real-life concussion after getting beaten up in a nightclub. The WWF had to write him off TV, and in the storyline, it was Owen Hart that gave him the concussion, and they made it sound like his career was practically over. But his win at the Royal Rumble put him on the road to WrestleMania, and while Bret was there too, most of the focus was on HBK and his mission to achieve his boyhood dream of becoming WWF champion. The Iron Man stipulation was meant to add a bit of drama, but the match dragged in the middle. After scoring the one and only pinfall, Shawn took the belt and told Bret to get the out of his ring. After WrestleMania, Bret left to film the Lonesome Dove TV show and didn't return until October. His presence was missed in the summer of 1996, but after the way he'd been treated the past couple of years, you can't blame him for wanting to try out a different career. There was another, more permanent loss in 96 when Scott Hall and Kevin Nash left for WCW. At a Madison Square Garden house show in May, Nash, Hall, Michaels and Triple H hugged in the middle of the ring, which seriously pissed off the WWF executives backstage. The problem was these guys had broken kayfabe, which was apparently still a problem for the management in the WWF, despite kayfabe being dead for at least a decade by this point. With Nash and Hall leaving the company and Shawn Michaels being untouchable as the WWF champion and the golden child as far as Vince McMahon was concerned, it ended up just being Triple H that was punished for the incident. He was meant to win the King of the Ring and get a big push afterwards, but that was immediately taken off the table. He lost to Mark Merrow at In Your House 8, and he was on the losing end of pretty much everything else until the end of the year. Also on this pay-per-view, a thunderstorm knocked out the power halfway through. That meant that they had to redo half the card 2 nights later in front of a far smaller crowd. This wasn't the WWF's fault, but it was fitting for a year that was a total shit show. One thing that was notable on the show was Steve Austin finally getting rid of Ted DiBiase as his manager. The stipulation for his match with Savio Vega was that if he lost, then Ted was banished from the Federation. Austin had had the credentials to be a top guy in the WWF from day one. He'd stood out in WCW's Midcard, and he'd showed a ton of charisma in ECW, and Vince McMahon should have recognised that immediately. He could talk and he could work, and he had real presence, yet the WWF gave him one of the blandest gimmicks of the decade as the ringmaster. And that's how he spent his first few months in the company, standing alongside a manager that did most of the talking for him, so getting rid of DiBiase here was definitely a good thing. Then came the King of the Ring, and with Triple H off the table, Austin got the nod. He beat Jake Roberts in the final and then cut the most blistering promo in wrestling history. That was the birth of Austin 316, and really the start of the Stone Cold character that we'd come to know and love, but his big push didn't come right away. He was stuck feuding with Mark Merrow, and at SummerSlam he was relegated to the dark match. Even after this iconic moment, when they needed someone who was the complete package, they still hesitated on pulling the trigger on his push. Shawn's WWF title feud with the British Bulldog felt like a bad soap opera. The storyline involved Davey Boy's wife, Diana, accusing Shawn of making inappropriate advances towards her. It was meant to be a serious angle, but it played out more like Days of Our Lives but with worse acting. And for Bulldog, it was just another main event loss. Vince loved to wheel out Davey when he had no one else to rely on. Since WrestleMania, Shawn had mostly been spinning his wheels in these peripheral feuds where he definitely wasn't ever going to lose the title, but Vader was meant to be the Goliath to Shawn's David and his first real big test against a dominant monster heel. The original plan was for Vader to win the title at SummerSlam and continue feuding with Shawn for the rest of the year and into 1997. The big man had been an incredibly effective heel in WCW in Japan, and in a year where the WWF was desperate for bad guys, he should have been an instant hit. He was both a terrifying presence and he was good in the ring, so what more could they possibly have wanted? The SummerSlam match was very good, but Shawn wasn't happy. At one point during the match, Vader missed a spot and Shawn threw a tantrum in the middle of the ring. Yes, HBK was still being a total asshole at this point, and backstage he complained that Vader was too stiff and careless in the ring, and he even said that he smelled bad. The Golden Child had spoken, and just like that, Vader's main event push was done. He slipped down to the mid-card for the rest of his contract, where he was mostly made to look like a total chump. The only silver lining in all of this was Psycho Sid, who stepped into his role towards the end of the year, and he was absolutely fucking brilliant at it. Sid ended up being one of the few genuine highlights of 1996. And it wasn't just the main event that was a problem, the mid-card was a disaster too. Let's start with Ahmed Johnson. When he debuted, Vince thought he had his next megastar. He was built like a tank and the fans genuinely liked him. He was Shawn's backup in big tag team matches, and he went on to win the IC title. But by the summer of 96, everything was falling apart. Ahmed just wasn't very good in the ring, and he was really injury prone, and he was reportedly rubbing people the wrong way backstage. He was in line for a title shot, but a health issue took him off TV, and the company gave up on him. Then there was Mark Merrow, who Vince really believed in. He even got the company's first ever guaranteed contract. McMahon thought he'd signed the next breakout star from WCW, where he'd shown a massive amount of charisma as Johnny B. Bad. But for some reason, he ended up becoming the Wild Man in the WWF, which was a gimmick that nobody really understood, especially not Merrow himself. Compared to his WCW character, he was like a totally different person. He did win the Intercontinental title, but that's about as far up the ladder as he ever got. The tag team division was just as bad, where the three main tag teams were the Body Donners, the Godwins, and the Smoking Guns. A combination of these three teams showed up on every pay-per-view until August. Then it got even worse when the New Rockers made their debut. The Godwins were especially tedious to watch. They summed up everything bad about the new generation, despite having a rubbish cartoon gimmick and practically no wrestling skills. They still showed up on TV every week. But even these two smelly bastards were better than what came in September, as Fake Razor and Fake Diesel made their debut. Yes, this was JR's heel turn, and it was an interesting way to get heat. The fans hated seeing Glenn Jacobs and Rick Bogner cosplaying as Diesel and Razor, but in reality this wasn't about JR, it was Vince lashing out. When Hall and Nash jumped to WCW, it instantly became the hottest wrestling show on TV. The NWO was catching fire and Nitro was hammering Raw every single week. But while Vince couldn't stop the talent from leaving, he still owned the gimmicks. But all this did was remind fans that Hall and Nash were just a channel away. In 1996, Vince was clearly fuming about WCW's success, which was evident when he produced the Billionaire Ted skits. This was a bunch of unfunny sketches featuring geriatric versions of Hogan, Savage and Ted Turner. The problem was, Hogan and Savage weren't jokes in WCW. They were still headlining and drawing fans, so Vince was only kidding himself. And as his business went down the toilet, he was wasting TV time on this garbage. The debut of Rocky Maivia was supposed to be a feel-good moment, but the audience hated him. Fans wanted something edgier, and Rocky was just a bland, smiling babyface. It looked like his career was totally screwed before it had even started. But by the end of 1996, you could tell that the WWF was trying to be more adult-oriented, at least in theory. Jake Roberts versus Jerry Lawler was a mean-spirited feud, with Lawler mocking Jake's alcoholism on TV. Then there was Austin breaking into Brian Pillman's house, which ended with Pillman pulling a gun on him. But as memorable as these angles were, it felt like they went too far, too fast. Jake reportedly hated having alcohol poured in his face because he was an actual recovering alcoholic, and the WWF never cleared the gun angle with the USA Network, which nearly got them taken off the air. But clearly, Vince had to do something to stop the bleeding. The final pay-per-view of the year was In Your House 12, and that did just 90,000 buys. That was down from 150,000 buys for February's In Your House show. That's a drop of 60,000 buys in just 10 months. But by the end of this train wreck of a year, Vince was finally starting to get a clue, and the next 12 months would be a turning point for the company. I'll probably have less to rant about in the 1997 video, but it's the WWF, so I'm sure I'll find something.